Welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast, where we break down the practical strategies of this emerging science, starting with healthy light habits and going wherever the quantum superhighway takes us. This is your host, executive and life coach Meredith Oke, with a quick reminder that podcasts are conversations, not consultations, and definitely not medical advice. We're here for informational purposes only. To follow up with our amazing guests, please do check out the show notes, and to stay in the loop with the QBC podcast, join our email list, also linked in the show notes. To the health-aware person, it has become a truth universally acknowledged that the healthcare system has a total misalignment of incentives when it comes to the best interests of the patients, i.e. us. The doctors and specialists are highly trained and motivated and taught to treat us at our most acute points with surgery and drugs, and are very ill-equipped to help us manage the whole rest of our lives, including the prevention of needing those things and the prevention of chronic illness. There is, however, a small but growing and getting louder body of physicians who are A, acknowledging this, and B, doing something about it. Our guest today is one of those doctors. His name is Dr. Eric Novack, and he's an orthopedic surgeon. He's been digging deep into the research on quantum biology and circadian rhythms and trying to apply it to his patients to help them prevent needing his surgical skills. He's kind of alone. It's kind of lonely when you pick that trail, when you pick that path, if you've probably noticed from many of the interviews on this podcast. But it's so important, and it's my privilege to support the brave and intelligent and wise doctors who are willing and able to do this. So you will very much enjoy my conversation with Dr. Novack today. And just a quick reminder, if you are a practitioner or a health coach or a doctor or anybody who works with clients or patients, a therapist, and you want to get into this on a deeper level than is possible by listening to a podcast, the Institute of Applied Quantum Biology is offering a certification, and the cohort is wrapping up registration, I think, as I speak. So please jump over to iaqb.foundation and check that out. If you aren't up for this cohort, please get on the wait list for the next one. The world needs you. The people need you. We really do. We need and appreciate everything you're doing. And if you'd like to be really highly engaged in a community of people who support and understand that, do go and join that certification. And of course, I would like to mention our lovely brand partner, bondcharge.com. Do hop over there for a 15% discount at checkout on whatever you buy, but I do recommend their blue blockers. This is just like a very basic circadian tool that I think everyone should have in their house. Just a little basket of blue blocking glasses. You never know when you're going to need them. Keep it in your handbag if you find yourself at a late night movie or something like that. All right. Enjoy my interview with Dr. Eric Novack. Dr. Eric Novack, welcome to the QBC podcast. I am delighted to be speaking with you.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay. So your experience is something that I find so deeply interesting, because I know that many of us have kind of an ambivalent relationship with social media and the technological, the way technology is kind of taking over our lives. On the flip side, that is how we met you. And it seems to me that that is how you kind of became aware of so many of the concepts that we're going to be talking about today. So just give us a little, just give us like the nutshell version of how you went from having a successful orthopedic surgical practice to like hanging out with us on Twitter talking about quantum biology.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on, Meredith. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I've been involved in healthcare delivery for 36 years now, because I started at 18 as an EMT after taking a class in college, and just went on from there to med school in San Francisco, and then did my orthopedic training up in Seattle. And we've been in the Phoenix, Arizona area for 23 years now. So, and my orthopedic practice is general orthopedics. It's really, as a lot of times things can change a bit over the years and over time. But at this stage of the game, I probably do about 60% trauma, so acute injuries, whether because I'm involved with one of the level 1 trauma centers in the Phoenix area, and then the rest of your usual knee and shoulder, et cetera, and part of a big group. My pathway to all this, I guess, is somewhat convoluted as most people's are. And, if something catches your eye, I mean, one of the things we know, and you don't have to be a doctor, or maybe it's better if you're not a doctor to realize it, which is that in spite of, in the US, spending now $4.4 trillion a year on healthcare in the country, one merely need just look around to find that we are less healthy, more overweight, less active, and more depressed than we've ever been before. So somehow we're in this deep ditch and we're digging it deeper, and spending money isn't getting it better. So the question is, what are we doing wrong? Or what are we missing? And that's kind of where it began, was this sort of general dissatisfaction of saying to myself, there's got to be something else. The whole health policy conversation is probably well beyond today, but the incentives in Western healthcare, particularly in the U.S., are so misaligned from health that it's helping get us to where we are today. So you do this for a while, you start looking around for are there other solutions or things out there that I hadn't seen before. And that's kind of how it happened. I'd say the biggest catalyst, there are two biggest catalysts in the last several years. Was one, I'm 54 now, and turning 50 is sort of a big thing. And I kind of woke up one day and said, it hurts to get around. Even though I was pretty healthy and exercised, I couldn't figure out why it made sense to be hurting, because I genuinely don't believe that the natural state of humanity is to hurt just because we're getting older. When you go to your primary care doctor or your orthopedist or whoever doctor and you say my knee or shoulder hurts, and they say, well, it's just because you're getting old, that is highly unsatisfying, and I don't think fair or correct, because that's not what we're meant to do. So I began my own little journey with that. And then my daughter, who's now 21, who's an excellent skier, tore her ACL about a year and a half ago. And so I had stopped doing them because I have partners that do a million. And so I started doing more research again into it, and found that the vast majority of people who get their ACLs reconstructed end up with arthritis in their knee, which is a little counterintuitive, because supposedly if we're making the knee more stable, shouldn't that be protecting it? And then I'm seeing in my practice more and more people in their 20s who tore their ACL as a teenager who have arthritic knees. I mean, and it was very disturbing. So,
and correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that kind of tear usually something that doesn't happen until later in life?
So ACL,
I'm in my 40s. I don't know a single person who's had that happen at my age. And now you're telling me all these kids in their 20s are.
Well, certainly the incidence seems to be going up in terms of ligament injuries in the knee. So the ACL is one of the 4 main ligaments in the knee, and it's generally torn through a non-contact hyperextension injury. Mm-hmm. But we're seeing it more and more, and we're honestly seeing it more and more we see it even more in teenage girls and boys these days. But we're seeing tendon injuries and those things that we used to see more likely in the 40s and 50s, in people in their 40s and 50s, and happening younger and younger. And I think we should probably get into all that. So I asked around saying, well, what are we doing to look at this problem of why people are getting arthritis younger and younger after their ACL reconstruction? And not only is there nothing out there, but no one seems to really care. Because it's not really the problem of those of us taking care of the problem at the time. And so that really took me down into the rabbit hole of trying to understand more. And I'd say that's how I began to come across all this stuff. And obviously, pretty much anybody in this space is aware of Dr. Cruz and sort of him being sort of the godfather of, I think, of synthesizing and proposing lots of things for this. And that's kind of where it's gone from there. One of the things I discovered along this journey, and there's nothing special about me, is that as best I can tell, and Max is far more connected than me, there are no other orthopedic surgeons that we can seem to find who are spending the time to look at this. So I feel like it's both an opportunity and a responsibility to try to make sure that things that I say are, to the best extent possible, accurate and honest and non-inflammatory, if that makes sense, because presumably people are listening. So that's really the journey. And it's now, I mean, I still have a very traditional practice. the issue is I spend a good portion of my time talking about lifestyle changes to patients. And that's eye-opening for me, and I think very eye-opening for them as well.
Right. Yes. Okay. So there's so many things to talk about. And yeah, what I will say, I think that you're correct. To my knowledge, there's not another orthopedic surgeon. There seems to be sort of one person in each category, in each specialty who's tweaked to this information. Like Dr. Jay Montgomery is an ophthalmologist, and we've got some general MDs, some endocrinologists. Like there's sort of one person in every area, and so I hope that you are the lighthouses for the others. But as you said, it seems to me like, from a patient perspective, right, which is mostly my perspective. I'm not a practitioner. I'm not a medical. I'm not trained medically, right? Like I came to this needing to get better. Although interestingly, you said the exact same thing I said to myself, which is like, there must be something else. That seems to be the question. And what I see now is, from the patient perspective, and we have a lot of non-experts who listen to this podcast, so I like to speak to them as well, is I see people who have such blind faith in their specialist doctors. And I don't like to interrupt that, because I do think that the medical community is hugely important to civilization and does a tremendous job. And if I were ever in any kind of acute crisis situation, I would absolutely want to go to the nearest hospital and see the best physicians possible and the best surgeons, like for sure. However, and I just want to explore this a little bit, right? It's like people just are like, no, my doctor told me this, and nothing else gets considered. And now from your perspective as the doctor, you're telling us that those doctors don't really look outside a very, very narrow scope. They don't see it as their job. They don't have the information, and they're not interested in finding it. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. It's incentives. Yes, we do acute stuff pretty well, not perfectly, and we do some other things decently too. I sort of draw the error curve, which is we know the rate of time in obesity, and we think that's a bad thing. We know the rate of overtime and diabetes, and we think that's a bad thing. And we know the rate over time and the incidence of whether it's autism or other neurodegenerative diseases or neurodegenerative diseases. All those, the curves are going in the wrong direction in the last 30, 40, 50 years. And we universally say that's a bad thing. Then you get to the musculoskeletal world, and we look at the rate over time and the incidence of knee and hip replacements. If anything, the curve is actually steeper in the US than it is for those other two conditions. And so you ask orthopedic surgeons or people in the musculoskeletal space, whether it's the surgeons or the hospitals or the surgery centers or J&J or DePuy or Stryker, who make the implants, they think we say this is a good thing. And
wow.
That is, it's just a question of where the incentives are, right?
Right.
We don't have, and so because we become just a world, and this is not just, I don't think medicine's really all that unique, in all honesty. I've always believed that, which is, we become a world of increasing specialization where the greatest rewards come if you're an inch wide and 10 miles deep. The problem is that when you live in that telescope or microscope, you really don't see what's around it, and you're highly disincentivized from doing that. And if you look historically at so many of the great minds over time, they were great minds, so but they were both 2 miles wide and 10 miles deep, if that makes sense. And so,
yes.
And that perspective, again, the incentives are against that today, whether it's in the research world or in the medical practice world. So that's how we kind of get there. And I agree. I mean, that's the challenge for talking about this. And I'm sure when you talk about it, people as well, which is you can either make it the bumper sticker version, but because it's so foreign to what most people are hearing, whether when they go to the doctor or on the news or when they just randomly search the internet, once you get past the bumper sticker of get morning sun, limit your artificial light at night, and eat while it's light out for seasonally appropriate foods. So you can say that in 15 or 20 seconds as a general recipe for health, but that's actually kind of foreign to a lot of people. So to get to the why, suddenly you're in this Pacific Ocean sized area where it gets very complicated very quickly. So honestly, one of the things that I continue to struggle with a bit, which is how and where do you pick those points for lay people to try to go in deeper. So maybe, as we go on today, maybe we can try to pick those points where it comes down to. In the musculoskeletal world, I do believe that so forget wrecking your motorcycle, which is a good part of how I make my living, those kinds of big injuries. So let's put those off to the side, because the conversation of the healing and all that other stuff, let's sort of leave that off to the side. But the basis of musculoskeletal pain still comes down to the concept of inflammation. Now, most people hear inflammation and they think of swelling, right? Something they can see. But swelling can be something you can see, but it also can be very much at that micro level, meaning the signals are being sent. And so this is where I think this whole story has such an important role to play, because then the question is, at the most fundamental level, what is inflammation? And I think that's where this world of quantum biology, decentralized medicine, whatever we're using to call it, which is a struggle too, because not having a perfect name makes it hard for people to get their brain around. I think that's a decent place to start, even though that's complicated in and of itself. And the issue is, the way we stay alive is we manage energy, and we keep our energy out of equilibrium, or that is to say, we do not have the exact same energy level as this glass of water, right? People generally accept if our energy state is at equilibrium with our surroundings, we are not alive. So optimal health, which would be the other extreme, which is how do we maintain ourselves with maximum energy disequilibrium, or sort of internal harmony, with a recognition, most importantly, that the inputs of energy are not what we think they are, right? You look at the news, you look what we grew up with, it's energy is what you eat, which, while we get some energy from food, the reality is that, and this I think is some of the part that's most crazy for people. People see plants and they say they get it from the sun. And somehow there's this idea that animals and humans don't derive energy from sunlight or information from sunlight. So continuing this down, the way we are in an optimal energy state is we're absorbing the information from the environment through the light, and we then incorporate it into that being. And part of that incorporation, which is the craziest part, is we actually produce our own light on the inside, and that also does signaling as well. So that's crazy to people, even though it's actually been known for almost 100 years from those original sort of onion root experiments that said, hey, there's something going from one tube to the next to allow these onions to grow, and we can block it if we block UV radiation. And then the other piece that's critical to know is that, again, if you've taken high school biology and you remember even a little bit of it, we think of, well, we've got calcium and sodium, and when you get your blood test back, there's calcium and sodium, and these ions are floating back and forth, and that's the battery that makes things move. But this fundamental concept that the electrical systems within the body are well beyond simply just pieces of salts floating back and forth across a membrane, which is what we did in high school. And that's been known for a long time too, but where we give all this credit to Robert O. Becker, who I like to say was an orthopedic surgeon, who did a lot of work in the 60s, sort of 50s, 60s, and 70s, and a little bit in the 80s. We know that that electrical signals, meaning protons and electrons, or predominantly electrons, are also this currency. So that's way more than a bumper sticker. But the optimal state involves getting information from the sun, reproducing it inside, and also our own electrical signals. So when that goes out of balance, that eventually, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, creates chaos, right? And that chaos is what is called inflammation. That is the easy way to think of it. And the primary, not the only, but the primary conductor that connects all of these signals to then what happens in the body is what happens in our mitochondria. So mitochondrial chaos is a result in inflammation. And honestly, when you go and you start with that premise, and then you start building your pyramid higher of larger and larger structures, you can now say, okay, well, now now that's actually something we can say, all right, well, maybe this is why people's knees hurt over time. This is why people are getting Achilles tendon ruptures when you at 25 and 30, where we used to not see it until 45 or 50. This is why people end up with chronic tendonitis that just won't go away. So that energy conversation, which is long-winded and hopefully it made some sense as I went through it, that's the foundation. So I think you start with this concept that it's an energy conversation, and there's no energy conversation without protons and electrons. You do not have to be a quantum physicist. You do not have to be a optical, be an expert in optics. But just that I think is the sort of the top line to understand. And if you look at all of your problems through that, now it suggests new opportunities to try to get people better.
Yes, and thank you for that. And I think, you're bringing up a good point, which is we have come to a place where we understand that the kind of food we eat is going to affect our health. I think there was a point, even in our lifetimes, where we were kind of like, does it really matter that much? And it's like, yes, it really does. So I think most people, whether or not they, have their behavior accordingly, they do understand that eating a lot of junk food is going to be bad for their health, is going to be bad for their biology. When you say to someone getting the wrong kind of light, there's toxic light, just like there's toxic food, they're like, uh-huh. And I'm like, they'll be, whether it's joints or fatigue or, like infertility, right? Like I just come across people all the time and they're struggling with these issues. And I'm like, optimizing your circadian rhythms can help with that. And they're like, uh-huh, because we have no paradigm for it.
Absolutely right. And it starts, honest, for most of us, with the conversations that we have within our extended families about this stuff. I think anybody who's talking about it, because we start by getting the strange looks from them. I have patients every day, literally every day, and at this point now multiple times a day, where I will make this case that what I'm saying, you just told me that your knees have been hurting for the last 8 months. There was no big injury. You want to be able to spend more time playing with your grandkids. You want to spend more time being able to walk the dog. You want to be able to go hiking. Whatever it's going to be, whatever people come in saying, and I say, you're here for 8 months. You just spent a $50 copay plus whatever it's going to be for all this stuff. Here's something that there's good evidence that can make a difference. Why not try some of these lifestyle things for 2 weeks, 30 days, depending upon the severity of the underlying condition, 60 days, 90 days, and see, what do you have to lose? And they look at you like you're insane. They do. When I say, wow. Yeah, I think the in short-term issue, probably the fastest bang for your buck over the short term probably is diet related for most people. The absolute best thing over the longer term is a complete revamping of your sort of circadian existence and how you view that. And we're all, I'm far from perfect, and the initial thing is we figure out why we can't do everything, right? What we can't do stuff. Honestly, I seem to get the eyebrows go up when I say try a essentially keto or carnivore diet for 2 weeks to 30 days. That they go up like to here. But when I say when it gets dark at night, you can't use your laptop, your phone, or your TV because it has to be dark. then the eyebrows go up to here. I mean, it's like I'm like ripping out parts of their soul if they can't watch Hulu or Netflix at night. So that's what we're struggling with. This addiction is, it's an addiction, and most of us are afflicted with it to a greater or lesser degree. And you can say, just like everything else, well, this person doesn't have to change anything and they're fine, right? My grandmother smoked until she was 95, right? The issue is that, well, the difference is that you're here because you're hurting, and you need to make different choices once you're starting to have pain.
Yeah. Okay, so let's draw that line. So on other podcasts, I've drawn the line pretty tightly to, digestion and other things, like having a dysregulated circadian rhythm is causing digestive issues in this way. And so I think it just feels like an even bigger leap to be like, it's causing you to be prone to ACL tears and joint pain. And so draw that line for us, like artificial light at night, lack of natural light exposure during the day. Like there's fairly strong evidence that this could be underlying why you're seeing ACL tears in younger and younger people and more chronic pain in older people. Why?
So
how?
Let's divide it up a bit. So let's look at the incidence of your 15-year-old volleyball player, soccer player who's tearing his or her ACL, right? Let's start with that group. So the argument amongst orthopedists, and I don't believe it's 100% wrong, to be honest, is that as any parent knows, and again, it doesn't matter actually if your kid's a sports kid or a theater kid, which mine were, it becomes all-consuming at an earlier age. And it is true that there are benefits to using, soccer uses different muscles than volleyball, uses different muscles than swimming. And when I was a kid, quote, the best athletes almost always did multiple sports every season, right? So there's something naturally protective about using different muscle groups in different coordinated fashions while we're growing. There's benefit to that. Yeah. Whereas if you're playing baseball 12 months a year, that is not great for your shoulder or your elbows. So that is absolutely a component of it.
Okay. But, so back to what you're saying about specialization, we're doing it to the kids too.
Oh, it's the
They're
worst.
starting to specialize in sports instead of playing a wide variety of stuff and specializing as an older teenager. They're doing it younger and younger. Okay. That makes sense.
It's terrible as far as I'm concerned. And honestly, many parents understand it, but you have no choice but to get wrapped up in it if your kid is really into the sport. Because if you're not doing your volleyball, if your daughter's not doing volleyball in many places all year round at the age of 10 or 11, well, when they get to the team that they really want to be on, the coach isn't going to play her. And then we just see that. And so forget the burnout piece. That's a whole separate set of conversations. Okay. Sort of staying on, let's just stay on the topic here. So when you stress muscles, tendons, ligaments, joints, right? That's a hormetic stress, right? That's this whole idea that it turns out to get stronger, we need stress between certain boundaries, right? Too little, you get weak. Too much, you create too much damage for yourself to repair. So most of us, and most of the time, you kind of live between these buoys, right? That are somewhere in that hormetic range. Question is how does the body respond to that stress of running the soccer field and kicking and doing all these things? Well, the body responds when you're sleeping to a large degree by repairing, and it responds to the signals it gets from those tissues, which, as we mentioned, probably to a greater degree than we've ever willing to believe before, are actually related to the kinds of light signals that are being created by the cells that are kind of unhappy from the work, and the direct electrical signals that then those create. Those are percolating through the system to create a response, whether it's at the immediate level for certain genes to be transcribed or new genes to be unlocked and transcribed, or the local environment to get stronger to respond to it, respond to damaged components of the cell, whether it's mitochondria or otherwise, with repair mechanisms to get stronger. Then the question is, okay, what actually happened? How does that happen? Or what's happening? So one of the things we need for that, we know the two things we always talk about in this space are melanin and melatonin, which in my view suffer from being words that are too close together. So it gets very hard to split them apart. But melatonin, which again, we think of as being the hormone of sort of darkness, right? Because when at night, our body releases melatonin from the pineal gland. It goes around the body and does its stuff, which is true. But that's only a very, very, very small part of the melatonin that the body creates. The vast majority of melatonin in our cells, or that our cells get access to, are actually produced within the mitochondria, are actually produced within the cells themselves. And that production, we believe, is predominantly driven by exposure to red and infrared light. And that basically is saying, hey, during the day, when you're outside and being exposed to red and infrared light, because even under the height of the midday Phoenix sun, more than half of all the rays that are coming down on us are infrared. They stimulate melatonin production. And so then we believe then that either through the course of the day or especially at night, are then serving to help prepare for that repair net mechanisms. So we can say people who have impaired melatonin production might have a problem with their repair or recovery mechanisms. And the other issue is melanin, which, as I think Jack has pointed out, as other people have as well, is sort of this universal, remarkable molecule that most mere mortals like me don't fully understand all of it. But basically, it is the magic. It absorbs all radiation of all types. And that absorbed radiation can then be used for an enormous, and it not can be, but is used for an enormous number of processes throughout the cell, whether it's reducing inflammation from these reactive oxygen species, or re-emitting new forms of light to help signal internally or locally or regionally, or being used to help split water so that you create more oxygen for respiration purposes. So there are all these functions. Then did I mention that this doesn't work well for bumper stickers when you start talking to people? Let alone like a parent of a 14-year-old who you want to change their behavior. But you have to do this. And now I have like that like microscopic inkling of what other people, when they talk about this, are. So you go through all this and you say, okay, why does this matter what does this matter for your 14-year-old? Here's the practical reason why. In order for your kid to have the greatest chance of not getting hurt, so he or she can play her sport and then go get the scholarship to college that everybody at the age of 8 is convinced their kid's going to get, they need to be up and get morning sun, because that is the first thing that's priming their body to be able to have the repair mechanisms to be able to get stronger and not get hurt. Second of all, they do actually need regular sunlight throughout the day, not covered with sunglasses, sunscreen, 27 layers, and looking like the younger sibling from A Christmas Story, in the middle of summer, to protect them from the evils of the sun. Because when you're not getting those signals, the body isn't creating melanin to serve these purposes. It's not about getting tan per se. When they're wearing their Bluetooth headphones, or I can't tell you the number of parents who come in for appointments and their kids just as the babysitter, they have Bluetooth headphones on, the big over-the-ear ones, and they're staring into their iPad the whole time. Those non-native EMFs, which we've been sold are not dangerous because it's not ionizing radiation, like when you come and get an X-ray, have a direct impact on cellular function. We know they affect ion flows across the membrane, which reduces the battery power that the cells have. And it also has a direct impact on our body's ability to generate energy. And again, we can go deeper into that. So now we've created it. So number one, they're not getting any morning sun throughout the day. So they're not getting their infrared radiation to create melatonin internally. Second of all, they're not getting UV exposure. So they're not creating melanin to serve additional signaling and antioxidant purposes. Then they're getting basically a poison to a certain degree of these non-native EMFs from their Bluetooth headphones and their Wi-Fi routers and the iPad up in front of their face and all these other devices that they have up against their body that are also impairing essentially energy maintenance, homeostasis, and production. And then at night, they sit on their iPad inside the whole day as well. So now they're getting what we believe to be another issue with sort of the modern era, which is it isn't that any one wavelength or series of a band of wavelengths by themselves are necessarily dangerous. It's that our bodies are meant to interpret the information of the symphony and not just listen to the fourth flutist because
Yeah.
when we're only listening to the fourth flautist, um, our body can't interpret that. It doesn't create the symphony when we only hear one piece, and it tries to fill in the blanks. And when it fills in the blanks, it does so very poorly, and that creates inflammation. So that's how the teenager ends up with inappropriate, inadequate repair mechanisms and growth mechanisms that can result in a greater likelihood of injury. And that doesn't even get to the downstream hormonal effects that then also feed back on this very complex biologic systems of not getting appropriate sex hormone production when you're growing at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 in the proper quantities or proper amounts. That stimulation essentially stealing resources to go from one thing to another. So that's a long-winded answer to say that that's that group. And so that's what we're seeing. And there's no question in my mind that that is a massive contributor to why we're seeing more injuries in kids today. I mean, we all ran around like maniacs growing up. And honestly, we ate crap.
Yeah.
I mean, I say that. I mean, and I love my parents desperately, but we ate crap. And I, of course, grew up in the era where, butter was evil, eggs were evil, margarine, and you ate margarine and had no salt and, only had ultra pasteurized skim milk,
Yes.
and somehow we survived crappy food, but the kids today are not. And again, that's whole different than the whole sort of leptin resistance, insulin resistance pathway. But we can get into some of that as well, because I think that applies to kids, but I really think that's a big piece of these adults who come into my office as well.
Right. So yeah, it's like we're getting squeezed from every angle, and our children are getting squeezed from every angle. So they're specializing in sports at a younger and younger age, which means they're overstressing certain muscle functions and underutilizing others. There's the burnout factor of that, which could be even if you're specialized in something outside of sports, that there's that burnout factor.
Absolutely.
Then we're taking away the natural light, partly out of habit and partly because we think it's bad, which gives their bodies what they need to be strong and resilient.
Yep.
And then on top of that, we're layering on the blue light, the EMFs, the wireless headphones. So we're like having a full scale assault on a body that is significantly weakened by not getting the resources that it needs to function optimally.
Exactly. And then diet contributes as well, because the truth is, I do think that some of the crap food that I ate 50 years ago, 45 years ago, is actually not as bad as the crap food people are eating today.
Yeah.
So
the food is worse, and the environment we're eating it in is worse.
Exactly.
And we're getting less sunlight. So
exactly.
we can't fight off.
GMO foods, there's a lot of talk about deuterium, and deuterium gets really complicated fast. But to dive into those ultra weeds just for a second, hydrogen is one proton and one electron. It's sort of the simplest. First, it's the most common. It's the most common element out there, and we need it because when we make ATP, we make energy in the cell, and when we manage the battery in the cell, we sort of manage to a not insignificant degree is our hydrogen flows. Well, hydrogen flows through this little engine that spins around, and it basically, as it flows through, it's like an old-fashioned water wheel, and as the water wheel turns, it creates ATP. Well, lots of the elements can have multiple isotopes, meaning they're really the same because they have the same number of protons and electrons, but they have these things called neutrons, which have no charge. So the elements can function similarly, but their weights are different. And so if hydrogen has a weight of 1, because it has 1 proton, and we don't count the electrons, deuterium has 1 proton and 1 neutron. So its weight goes from 1 to 2. So again, without turning people into physicists here, what they call the isotope effect, which is what happens when you just add the different, how do different materials act or elements act when there are different weights, and they matter. So when you double it, that's a big difference. So it turns out that the body does need deuterium, and does utilize it, because there's really nothing that nature over billions of years hasn't figured out ways to use. But when we eat food that is just laden with deuterium,
which is junk food and processed food,
which is a large part of processed and junk food, and a lot of the GMO foods, we cannot produce energy properly. And that predisposed that, again, if you
So is that water wheel you were talking about, like getting sludged up?
Yeah, it gets right. And we have multiple in every, even in one mitochondria, we have multiple motors, and then we have multiple mitochondria depending upon the cell type. So when you sludge up that motor and you basically stick a big rock into it, or a big sort of a pencil into the into your bicycle wheel that's spinning, it can't run. And that's why I try to bring it back to this most simple concept. If you can't manage energy properly, that is chaos. It creates chaos, and chaos is inflammation. So that's where the diet fits in. So not only do you have this high deuterium diet, and a lot of the supposed healthy fast food places, for the people who've done the research, the food that they have is actually horrendously bad from that perspective, because the more processed things they use along the way of making it tends to be the higher deuterium content. The second piece, of course, which are people like Stephanie Seneff and many other people have talked about, this idea of glyphosate, which is an herbicide. When it comes to injuries, et cetera. So now, just because more and more people are eating almost all processed food and not making regular foods or homemade foods, glyphosate, probably number one, does have direct issues in terms of energy production. But glyphosate, we know, damages the bacteria in our gut. Yes, it's supposedly done. It injures bacteria and not cells, but we rely on our gut bacteria to, number one, produce things. Number two, to produce light that signals us the environment. So we're not getting that piece of it. And the second thing is we absorb it. And then collagen, which is the single most common protein in the body, and you really can't talk orthopedics without at least briefly touching on collagen. There are a bunch of different types, and different types make up different percentages in our different tissues. So tendons, the things that connect muscles to bone, ligaments, cartilage, and bone itself all have different kinds of collagen. And collagen is sort of a triple helix, where the proteins that make up the collagen, with the components that make up the collagen protein, sort of every third one is an amino acid called glycine. And glycine and glyphosate, not just because they sound similar to start with, glyphosate can fit into the glycine spot as collagen is made. So it fits in, but then it's too big for it to wrap around to make the appropriate kind of collagen. So that's also how
it's got like fake inputs. It's the collagen's trying to structure itself, and it's got this like copy.
Exactly. It's got it's got the square piece to fit through the square hole, but after it starts going through the square hole, there's an extra like big bulbous thing that blocks it. So now it can't necessarily, we believe, create the structure that binds like it's supposed to for the proper strength. So that's, we think, potentially also a contributing factor for how horrendously horrible, no sunlight, lots of non-native EMF diets, and then you add a horrible diet, maybe is predisposing us to having more musculoskeletal issues at younger and younger ages.
Right. And without the sunlight charging our structured water, we have an even harder time getting rid of all of these toxins that are building up.
Right. So we think about joints. So Ina's mentioned that we've always just thought of water, and I always think of there's the folks who are working with things like consciousness, which is even further beyond my expertise than that. But this idea that the brain is just a fancy computer. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to be able to create an artificial intelligence. The next ChatGPT is just going to be able to master what a brain does. Well, the reality is it's really more of a quantum computer at factors we can't possibly understand. So when we start combining all these things together, the complexity gets so high that there's no way it can happen. And so for water is another one of those things. If you look at a cartoon model of the body, just like a cartoon neuron when they talk about, water is just the stuff that's kind of where all of the bits and pieces of the cell, and this is how I learned it, are just floating in water. But we know, and it's been known for decades, it just is never taught. And I honestly can't figure out why, that water is a it's just it's just amazing what it does, which is why when they're looking for signs of life on other planets, the first thing they look for is signs of water.
Right. Water. Yeah.
Because of the ability of water to function as its own battery when it's subjected to infrared light as it heats up. It can separate charges. It also clearly appears to be able to be its own conveyor of information within the water molecules themselves, as the research has shown over time. So when we think about in joints, and it's really important to get exposure, because that infrared and red light can actually penetrate through your knee and your shoulder and your ankle, and has a harder time getting to the hip, but infrared light can get through to your hip joint. That actually also helps with your structured water or easy zone or exclusion zone water. And when you increase the size of that structured water layer, you actually improve the battery power, which gets back to improves energy production, maintenance, and homeostasis, which reduces inflammation. So it keeps coming around and around like that.
Okay, so there is no doubt that the science is complex, and even just to establish ourselves in a non-biochemical paradigm is complex. However, as you've alluded to, the actual practical implications are fairly simple, which I think also works against us sometimes. People are like, what? Just that?
Yes.
Right? So it's like, eat real food, eat organic food if you can. So would the glyphosate be mostly coming in from crops that have been sprayed with it, or are there other culprits that we don't think about?
So from my understanding of it, obviously it tends to be much more common in grains. So, obviously most of the time, and certainly in some countries, many countries have banned it, but in the US we don't. And glyphosate isn't the only one. So that's an issue with almost all grains from the US. So that's number one. As Stephanie Seneff talks about, and people like Jack allude to when he's urging people to ditch the cities and come other places, is that biodiesel, which tends to get up into the air, particularly in big cities. So all these vehicles that are supposedly being green by using biodiesel, when they burn the biodiesel, that glyphosate is completely aerosolized from the production of the crops that are used to make the biodiesel.
Oh, no.
So that's the
Eric,
argument.
I didn't know about that one.
Yeah, so that's the argument within the cities. So, look, most people can't, and again, and I understand the point of view, and honestly, I think for people who are sick enough, the sicker you are to start with, the more drastic you need to be willing to consider to make your life changes. That is just simply the case. Because obviously, if the entire population of LA moved to El Salvador, suddenly El Salvador wouldn't be El Salvador, right? That's just the case, right?
Yes.
So most people can't go. So what do you tell people? So this is what I've gone to tell people this is a multiple a day conversation. Your knees have been hurting. Okay. You want to make your knees hurt less? Go to a no carb diet for the next 14 to 30 days. That's just it. You just have to. I said, I am 1000% convinced is the single most efficient way to immediately reduce inflammation. And if people ask me, if anybody gives me really why? And there's a couple of reasons. Number one, when you burn fats, they start further in that energy producing chain. They enter at step 2, not step 1. We produce more of these reactive oxygen species or reactive nitrogen species at step 1 than step 2. So number one, it produces less inflammation. Number two, ketosis. So beta hydroxybutyrate, which is one of the things that we produce for ketosis, is a directly inhibitor of things of the transcription of inflammatory cytokines in cells. And so it reduces that. So that it does there. Insulin, if we can assume that they say that up to 90% of people are metabolically unhealthy. So a component of metabolic unhealthiness is insulin resistance, which means to get the same effect, you have a higher level of insulin floating around. Insulin is pro-inflammatory. It causes an increase of some of these inflammatory cytokines, which is why diabetics have a much higher rate of a lot of these musculoskeletal conditions, and they don't get better as well. So that's just the basics of it. So number one, if you're hurting today, and again, this is not, I guess I should preface, as the doctor, I'm not giving specific medical advice to any one person, but you need to go basically carnivore for the next 2 to 4 weeks. And if your condition's worse, you may need to go even higher and go longer before you start seeing a significant impact. The anecdotal evidence all the way down to the basic science and below suggests it is the most important, most significant short-run anti-inflammatory thing you can do. That's number one. Number two is eat only when it's light out and stop eating as close to going to sleep as possible. That's the food component of it. Yes, there's intermittent fasting, there's other stuff, but if we just start with that, because sometimes telling people not to eat for 16 or 18 hours a day is a big leap for people. So I just start with that. Number two is you need to be up and get the morning sun. I don't care. You just roll out of bed. In the summer in Phoenix, it should be easy because it's too hot pretty quickly. Just get out of bed at 5:30, go grab your cup of coffee or not, and just sit outside, preferably with your feet on the grass, because that's a separate topic, to get no sunscreen, no sunglasses. That infrared light's going to go through your clothing, so you don't need to march around naked. Just get your 15, 30 minutes, if you can, of morning sun. To the extent that you can with busy lives, try to get some daytime sunlight. If you haven't been doing much, start very limited, particularly in places where there's intense sun, like here in the valley. Try to see sunset the same way you saw sunrise. Those are a couple of things, the basics. As Jack talks about, that we were designed to be in cold environments, almost all of us. So the idea of utilizing cold exposure to help mobilize our body, not as most of us learned about it growing up, which was go do a hard workout and then go jump in an ice bath. It's probably the opposite is the case. You should probably be getting your cold exposure, not afterwards. You want to do it before, if anything. It's hard here in Phoenix because your tap water, your shower water is going to be 90 degrees, 85, 90 degrees. So again, it's a big lift for people. I mean, my population is, I have very fortunate. I have an extremely wonderful middle-class population I take care of. And some of them might listen to people like Joe Rogan, but most people can't go out and spend $12,000 on a Marasco Forge cold plunge. There are much less expensive options, but even then, things are expensive. So cold exposure is hard in the summertime here. But in the wintertime, you should be trying to get some real cold. Don't live at 70 degrees all the time. That's kind of your basics. I always like to throw one other thing out as well, because I do believe this is completely true when it comes to all things health-wise. Mindset is so unbelievably important. People who don't want to get better, you can do the best operation in the history of humankind. If people don't want to get better, they're not going to get better, no matter what the x-ray looks, no matter how good the x-ray looks like when you're done. So you need to, this is not quantum. Maybe it is quantum. We have to understand that connection between fitness and mentality.
Totally quantum.
But this idea, we know we can affect our reality. I always like to say, the placebo effect has been used by pharma basically to say things don't work. Placebo effect, what it really means is, if our mind really believes something, we can actually alter our physical reality of our bodies for things to get better. That's the astounding part of it. So why aren't we working harder to try to harness that, right? So you need to be positive. And part of being positive, I believe, is having a vision that there's something greater than yourself out there. It doesn't have to be religious per se. That spiritual belief that there's something to live for, I think, is incredibly important. And I think if anything that this world is missing or is suffering from at this moment in history, is what Viktor Frankl, who is a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, called the existential vacuum. Basically, when we have no sense of what we're for, what we believe in, that creates this massive vacuum to which all of this horribleness can start to slip into because we're grasping onto stuff. And I think we see a lot of that in the world today. So it all relates together, and as I tell people, the second most common reason people go to the doctor after an upper respiratory infection is for some musculoskeletal complaint. And if you've ever been hurt, you know that life is really hard when you're hurting. So we try to avoid it. And it turns out there are steps we can take that are cheap. They're simple. We know they work over the long haul. They do require discipline, and some hard choices. But if we start with the small bits, we can do it to where we make ourselves not only better today, but the best chance to be better for the longest lives we can possibly have with the greatest meaning.
Yes. And I'm so glad you brought it there, because that is where I was going to go next. With the mindset piece, circling back to what brought you into this world in the first place, that question, there must be something more, right? Which was the same question that came up in my mind from the patient end of the spectrum. Those types of questions, that kind of positive mindset where it's like, I refuse to just hit this wall and smash against it and crumpled up and stay there. Like, there must be something more. That comes right from an expanded mindset, which comes from, to Viktor Frankl's work, our intrinsic need for meaning. And when we have meaning in our lives, it becomes much easier to have that mindset. It becomes much easier to make hard choices because we've got something pulling us forward. And, I was just going to say that I've noticed, sort of anecdotally, we were talking earlier about the traditionally trained physicians who come into this field. And I've noticed, I'm just observing, there are kind of two pools of view. There's people sort of earlier in their career who are really driven by wanting to be on the cutting edge and wanting to really understand, like, what can I know? I need to know the most, like, to be of service. And then there's the people who have been in practice a little bit longer, who are coming at it from, like, why isn't what I've been taught working? And there is an element, a quality of humility and a quality of faith and an openness to the importance of spiritual and emotional growth and meaning in our lives that I see with you, I see with Max Gulhane, Jalal Khan, Roger Schwelt, Francisco Gutierrez, like every one of you who has had the courage and the curiosity to step forward and research this field and apply it and come on here and talk about it has shared all those qualities. So
well,
wanted
thank
to
you.
acknowledge
I hope
that.
we're a growing group, both on the traditionally trained and otherwise. And the hope is that, can we start making this a bigger part of medical education? I'd say the great crime of science of the post-war period, last 70 years or so, of which medical education is a piece, is a belief that we know it all, that we have a purely mechanistic view of the body and life. And different people point to different sort of key moments where we sort of move down that road. But all the smart people today view life as purely mechanistic, meaning, if we can't dissect it and see it under the microscope, it's not real. And that's horribly dangerous when it comes to the things that we view that are important in life and freedom and creativity and all these things that we traditionally have had a harder time quantifying. But we know matter, because if you look over the centuries and the millennia to cultures, the things that have survived to a large degree in different cultures have been those pieces of it, not the purely mechanistic pieces. So when you see the little blurbs on videos and things of some of these supposedly super smart people trying to boil everything down to, well, we can just make a computer with connections that do this. Or I looked inside, I saw that, I looked inside and there's no free will when you dissect the brain or the heart, or, there's no free speech when you start dissecting in a body, like it's not there. Those are the people who I think in some ways are the most dangerous in the world that we live in today. Most people know that they're wrong, but they don't know how to articulate that they're wrong, and they get cowed because people use lots of big words and make them feel dumb. So I'd encourage all the people who watch this is that you always have to have an open mind. You don't accept things out of hand, whether it's from you or me or anybody. I think you need to do some of your own thinking about stuff, but equally important not to dismiss things equally out of hand. And then we try to come up with our best answers to try to see how do we fit in, and what's the purpose? How can we contribute to whether it's the world or the earth or society or our grandkids or science or medicine or art or music? The opportunity to make those impacts. They're always beyond what we think they can be. And our ability to touch other people's lives. Sometimes I guess I found in my 54 years, I found it the other way around, in all honesty, also, is that I think some of the things that have stuck with me are some of these rare moments where I know that these other people, it was just an offhanded remark, good or bad or otherwise. That was a throwaway comment. And I've made life decisions that I honestly regret because I took some offhanded comment to heart. Equally, I've had people make comments to me over the years that I always joke, sometimes I can't remember my kids' names, right? I run through all 3 dogs and both kids before I get to the child's name properly. But, I can remember one sentence from what somebody said to me in some setting 35 years ago that hangs with me. And so that's a responsibility. Maybe that's some of the humility of getting a bit older with it, but everyone should have that. We have a great ability to impact people and to be cognizant with that. As time goes on, I guess I try to say it all the time, which is, I think there's a couple of good laws in medicine that are to have, which, and one of them is that humility is the single most important. We're going to continue to learn. The only absolute truism over the centuries for medicine is what's dogma today, more than likely than not, is going to turn out to be absolutely false tomorrow. So having some humility, I think, is important for these things. And then when you're as a surgeon or as a patient, you always want to say the best operation is the one I've never had. It doesn't mean you don't need them. It doesn't mean you won't get better. It doesn't mean if I'm the person doing it, I can't get you better. It's not an excuse not to do surgery. It just means that, be circumspect. And, we live in a system of bad incentives. So you have to take agency and ownership over your own health. And honestly, the magic of taking a circadian view of living and eating and thinking is that it really doesn't cost anything. So you don't have to be wealthy. You don't have to have a bunker in Montana to be able to do it, or a fancy yacht that can go on the seas, or have a house in the mountains somewhere. So those are all things we can do without lots of resources. They take work and they take change, but they're all really doable.
Yes. And I think just the idea that, we live in a world where our biology is being assaulted in many different ways, and to just have some awareness of what that means so that we can make the best choices that we can for where we are.
Agreed.
And feel supported by communities and podcasts and doctors. So thank you for being one of those people and for all that you're doing to change the landscape. It's much appreciated.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. And I enjoy the show and all the great conversations you get to have.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, we'll have to have you back and go down some more rabbit holes. That was really fun.
Thank you.
Woohoo! You made it to the end of another episode. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploratory adventure into new realms. Your energy and support are building a different world, and I am so grateful to be on this journey with you. Take care and thanks.